Hello, everyone, and welcome to your week 7 lecture. Today, we are continuing our look at identity and actually wrapping up today. And we're thinking about two kind of concepts, fragmentation and hybridization. We're still in this mode of thinking through identity and how it's been conceived in relation to the nation. Last week, we looked at the different analytical approaches to identity, or at least a couple of different analytical approaches to identity that structure some academic debates around feminist theory and intersectionality. And today, we're going to look at how two other scholars think about the experience of identity, maybe within, against, or around the nation and its borders, or their experience of the national consciousness. We saw in the beginning of this unit with Deloria that the dominant narrative around American identity conceives of it in gendered and racialized terms and their associated traits. As Kaplan argues, there's a rugged masculinity to this construction of protectiveness and adventure. This image is also racialized, often through the concept of whiteness and the moral traits that are often associated with it, like civilization, purity, sanity. The John Wayne figure in the American Western is an example of that archetype and how it has been formed. But similar to last week, we're considering, again, more approaches to self-identification with respect to American national culture and identity by engaging with a couple of key concepts that arise specifically out of the American context and in response to these dominant ideas about culture and identity. The first is W.E.B. Du Bois's theory of double consciousness experienced by Black Americans, or at least in his theorization. It's the fragmentation of Black American identity and consciousness. And the second is Gloria Anzaldua's conception of borderlands and the mestiza or the new mestiz, which is the hybridization of language, space, and culture around identity, a hybridized version of identity specifically made or produced by the bordering of a nation or the border space of a nation. Today, we'll talk a bit about the previous reflection. I'm going to go over the cultural object analysis because it's coming up shortly, or at least by the time some of you might watch this video. I wanted to make sure that you had it in time or a review in time. We'll do the provocation. We'll talk about Du Bois fragmentation, Anzaldúa hybridization, critical questions, and conclude. So with the previous reflection, overall, they were good. I could see that there was a lot of emphasis on Black women in particular, which is Crenshaw's specific example, but I would say that wasn't necessarily the focus of the lecture. Last lecture was not predominantly about understanding intersectionality as a universally accepted framework, but thinking about it as a framework amongst others approaching a similar set of questions about the relationship between identity and what is variably called oppression, exclusion, subordination, marginalization, etc. I think overall, it was good to see several of you trying to wrap your head around the differences and similarities between Foley and Crenshaw's approaches. A number of you actually were like, this is kind of difficult. This one is a difficult one to grasp, and that's totally fine. And the reflection is totally where you can voice that. But as you were wrestling with this concept, the conceptual interventions that they were making, and that was the main thrust of the lecture, trying to articulate those convergences and divergences, I could see that there was maybe some space for clarification. One, they are somewhat contemporaries in that there's overlap between Crenshaw and Foley in terms of when they are active scholars, though Foley was active earlier than Crenshaw and is now retired. But the two articles are written nearly 30 years apart. So, like many scholars' debates, they happen over a long stretch of time and under different conditions. So it's kind of like reviewing, like let's return to this sort of original idea and think about it a bit more. So as a reminder, Crenshaw was intervening in the feminist theory and practice of the late 80s and early 90s in that particular article by arguing for an intersectional approach. And Foley is intervening in the contemporary moment in which intersectionality is now a common approach or framework. And then just by way of clarification too, I think it was fairly clear that even as people were wrestling with these ideas, there's still some misconceptions or misunderstandings about what it means that Crenshaw and Foley are operating using different conceptual frameworks. The challenge with all conceptual thinking is trying to understand the difference in frameworks and which means shifting how one is conceiving of, which is to say, conceptualizing or understanding certain terms and ideas. Foley and Crenshaw do not share a conceptual understanding of class. That is the primary difference for them. So even to call Foley's approach an economic one, which many of you did, is to kind of misunderstand her use of the term class along the same lines as Crenshaw is appropriating it. What Crenshaw is describing is personal wealth, or we might say wage, how much money people earn or have. And she's doing so in isolation or irrespective of anything else. Remember, it's kind of a discrete category like race and gender. They're kind of discrete. They meet and intersect, but they are these sort of separate identity categories. That particular understanding can make a kind of immediate sense under capitalism because our access to resources is marked by the use of currency or money. But Foley's conception of class is a Marxist one, which is not about personal wealth per se or precisely or exactly that, but about one's place in the reproduction and maintenance of society, a society being a collection of people living and working in coordination with each other to improve the entire collective's chance at survival, and with a particular set of social relations or relationships built around that, which again is to say a strategy, which is often called a mode of production. Remember that in this analysis, capitalism is not the only class-based society in history. Feudalism, with its nobility structures, is a class-based society. Ancient Rome was an early class-based society. There were many non-class-based societies throughout history. This does not mean that people didn't do different kinds of work. It just meant their role in society did not mean they had more or less access to the resources that society produced and that are needed for people to survive, like food, shelter, or clothing. So again, just to reiterate, Crenshaw seems to be using class to mean personal wealth or wage. But in Foley's analysis, under capitalism, there are only two classes, the working class and the ruling class. The working class are those who do the work necessary to reproduce society, generate its wealth and resources. In other words, keep it going in exchange for a wage under capitalism, which is to say nearly all people. And the ruling class is a rather small contingent who collectively as a class own the means of that production and extract their wealth from that work of that other group of people. They don't work themselves. They extract the wealth from what the others are producing. The relationship in question then is not between individuals, not between a ruling class person and a working class person. It cannot be measured and even more rarely identified that way, but between two classes as total entities in a whole society that make up an entire society. So in Foley's argument, everyone working at General Motors, even the CEO to some extent, is subject to this class relation. They are members of the working class. However, they are further ordered into a hierarchy within that determinative class relation by race, gender, ability, sexuality, etc. If we are to look back at the metaphor of the intersection again, In Foley's assessment, people are only even in the intersection. They are only standing on the road because of their class position. They can only be hit by a car because of their, or any cars because of their class position, because they are members of the working class. Members of the ruling class can't experience oppression because they own the means of the oppression. They are the oppressor. They determined access to food, clothing, or shelter, and so their own access to these things is not determined by any of those roads. Someone might be able to be mean to them or call them a bad name. They might even lose some wealth or a company, maybe on the basis of their identity, or arguably on that basis. But their interests are, but their interests are the ruling ones. They are in charge. So no, the system itself, at least as a class, right? Not individually, but as a class, their interests are the ruling ones. They are in charge. So the system itself can never materially or ideologically work against their interests or favor. Recall too that this means ruling class does not necessarily mean exactly, it's not equivalent to politicians, though in a Marxist analysis, it would be acceptable to say that political decisions are generally made in the interests of the ruling class. So I'm going to briefly go over the cultural object analysis now and some of those expectations. So you are being asked to conduct a close reading. This is, and it's due March 16th. That's the due date for the cultural object analysis. So it's before spring break. Um, that get it out of the way, I would say. But then also, should anyone take the grace period, you would have access to that over that time. But then again, and I want to reiterate that if you do take the grace period, you will not receive written feedback on the analysis. And again, not a punishment. It's just, or a disciplinary measure. It's just about time management for me and keeping up with the grading. You're being asked to conduct a close reading of a cultural object. So a lot like what we do with the provocations every day, which is like do a close reading of them, think about them in relation to the concepts that we learned that day. And so you're being asked to look at them through the lens of one of those concepts. And again, a concept from a course reading. For example, an example of some of these concepts might be noble savagery or homeland or imagined community, something along these lines, or Benedict's conception of a nation as an imagined community. And just to remind you, remember that when we synthesize different works or information, we need to arrive at an idea or clarification that we might not have had otherwise, that we might not have otherwise considered had we looked at these two things separately. What does Kaplan's elaboration of the term homeland help you to better understand about the object you are looking at, or vice versa, by way of an example? Or how does that object challenge her description, etc.? So some things to note, you will need to quote from the text itself that you are drawing the concept from in order to make whichever conclusions about the cultural object that it is helping you to reach clear. The close reading you have been doing in the reflection assignments has been helping you to prepare for this. The formal details of your cultural object will be important. Many of you are in the reflections still just offering general interpretations about the significance of the provocations, and that will not get you the grade that you want in this assignment. For this, you need to generate a clear argument supported by your detailed reading of the object. You will need to justify the claims you made about it. You are not being graded on if your reading matches common readings. of the text, or sorry, of either the text or of the object, but on the strength of your argument, meaning how well you justify it using the evidence you provide from both. What is also important to note is, and there's a little bit more about this in the formal requirements, this is a formal essay. It is not an APA or ASA paper, and it is not like a scientific paper. You should not have subheadings or a title page. You should have an introductory paragraph with a clear thesis statement, body paragraphs that support your thesis, and a conclusion. Again, um, there's supplementary readings in the course files for you to look at about essay writing, about close reading, etc. You should be as specific as possible at all times, and you don't need to say anything sweeping about humanity or history as a whole. Um, that is unlikely to be supported in a 2 to 3 page essay, but also I generally say absolutes are usually just false, right? So anything that suggests that all of humanity has been 100% one way all the time, generally a false statement. And also, you don't need to make that kind of a general statement. Be as specific as possible. I think it's a pretty good habit or get in the habit of bringing up the author, the object itself in the first sentence of your paper. You should already be talking. In a 2 to 3 page paper, you should already be talking about what you're going to talk about right from jump. I do not dock marks arbitrarily for meeting or exceeding page limits. So you can see that you're expected to have 2 to 3 pages double spaced. This is a guideline, not a strict rule, but this is how long I think it will take you to write an A-level argument. So that being said, please don't arbitrarily add words or extra spaces or change the font size or cut down your paragraphs to make this page count. Instead, ask yourself if you've offered enough evidence to justify your reading, or if you've gone too far off topic in places or made extra arguments that go beyond the assignment scope to decide whether to add or cut from your essay. Again, because of the length, another piece of advice, be sure to choose an appropriate or digestible object. A novel is not a good subject for something this short, but maybe a specific scene from one is. An episode from a show also, but not the entirety of a show's run or season. The object also needs to be clearly related to American culture, but doesn't necessarily need to be American. It could be something commenting on American culture from a different vantage point, or as we've seen with some paintings, incorporated into the American canon from abroad. But it can't just be like a random Caravaggio painting, at least not without some kind of historical or contextual work to make that connection clear. It also does need to be some kind of an object, a discrete object. I think previously I've run into things where people are like, my object is basketball. I'm like, that's a big sport. Maybe pick like a team logo or something, like make it specific and make it a particular object, and not the idea of something. This assignment is not exactly like the reflections. The reflections are very loose in their assessment because they are where you are in effect thinking out loud and practicing your skills. This is meant to be a demonstration of them and a more rigorous intellectual exercise. So once more, with feeling, I do not recommend the use of generative AI to write this essay. It will try to give a right answer to a question that does not have one. And because that is not what you are being asked to do, it will do that poorly. You and your grade are better off going to the writing center or coming to office hours to help in developing your reading or ideas. Importantly, familiarize yourself with the rubric at the end of this document. that is your best guide for understanding how your essay will be graded. If you choose the essay option, it outlines what is important and what is expected. But it is only one option. You do have a creative option to this assignment, which is to create an object in relation to a concept from a reading. And you would need to include the quotation somewhere with your object as well, or at least in your explication, because then you're going to write a 1 to 2 paragraph long explication of why your object is either critical of or um, exemplary of your concept. You will be demonstrating your understanding of this concept, and you will be synthesizing the concept with your creative object. If you choose this option, you do need to propose it in advance, and you can propose it no later than March 9th. And I hope it's understood that I would need to approve your project. This is the bigger warning. I don't necessarily do the same thing with the written objects. I just sort of grade them as is, but if you submit a creative submission and I at all suspect it of AI or any kind of automated generation, it will just receive a 0. So do not choose this option and do that. You will have to appeal the grade separately through whichever appropriate administrative offices. I won't be like reviewing it if you wanted to object to that. And then there's some formal requirements depending on, I don't know if whatever kind of creative object you would want to do, these are the formats that it would need to be in. There's the option run 1 rubric. Remember, familiarize yourself with these rubrics. Option 2 rubric. This is telling you how these things will be graded. When you get your grade back, these will be highlighted, as well as some written feedback if you submit it on time. You can always email me questions about the assignment. And then just remember a reminder that the grace period is a hard stop. So without something really, really serious emergency and some verification extending beyond the grace period, that is you giving yourself an extension if you take the grace period on any of these written assignments. And if you do not propose your creative assignment and you submit one anyway, it just won't be accepted. You did need to formally propose it beforehand. That being said, here is your provocation for this week. You can also find it in the supplementary documents in case you need to take a closer look at it. And remember to pause the video here. You're doing your describing the provocation and your initial thoughts section, and being attentive to the formal details. Another reminder, we use terms like stanza, line, speaker to break down a poem. So we are talking about Gloria Anzaldúa and Borderlands / La Frontera. We're thinking about those two formulations or about in approaches to identity today. With Gloria Anzaldúa, a little bit about her. She was an influential scholar and a poet. She was based out of California and taught at colleges and universities. She published multiple books. She was completing her dissertation at UC Santa Cruz when she died in 2004, and the university awarded the PhD to her posthumously in 2005. The selection of hers that you read for class is called How to Tame a Wild Tongue, and it is in a collection that has become very important to Latin American studies. Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, was first published in 1987. Anzaldúa is very concerned with cultural hybridization, or the ways new cultural formations arise around or within border spaces. and distinct geographies. And then also how imperialist and colonial histories form tense conflations of dominant and oppressed cultures. In Borderlands, she writes about the specific Chicano and Mestiz culture that emerges in the parts and of the U.S. that were once Mexico or in the areas that surround the border. This includes unique and hybridized forms of art, labor, and language. The section you read is especially focused on language and how it is hybridized and also oppressed. She is also a pioneer in what is now called auto theory, which is an especially feminist practice in using one's own life as a source of critical theory. And I've added to a little bit here about diaspora. So thinking about a group of people who are dispersed from their ostensible homeland. So, How to Tame a Wild Tongue is the part of the book, and I would say the whole book is kind of like this, is a part of the book that is especially concerned with the relationship between language and cultural identity. Borderlands is an interesting book in that and you probably noticed in the chapter, in that it changes form all the time. Sometimes it's poetry, sometimes it's more theoretical explication, sometimes it's autobiographical, it's just memories from her life. And so it moves in these different ways. And then it also speaks in a hybrid language. So at times there's Spanish, at times there's slang in different forms of Spanish and different dialects, as well as English. This matters to our discussion of the nation for many reasons in terms of cultural identity, but also because, and this is not in the specific part of Benedict Anderson's book that you read, but he does go on to explain in the cultural roots of nationalism that standard and unified language is one way historically that nations form or govern national identity. In fact, one of his arguments is that until the invention of the printing press, which means masses of people could have access to the written word, not just nobility, clergy, or other elites, there's no such thing as like a common or standard language, and common people could not really identify themselves as part of a nation because they very seldomly spoke or participated in shared language beyond their immediate community, nor did they have access to many of the ruling class's ideas. So we have the opening quote that she has at the beginning, who is to say that robbing a people of its language is less violent than war. And then that's sort of the epigraph of the chapter. And then she also says, wild tongues cannot be tamed, they can only be cut out. So for Anzaldúa, the combined forces of racism and sexism are it, play a role in cutting out the wild tongues of the borderland, these dialects, these creolized, hybridized dialects that arise out of the border areas, right? Borderlands are spaces that defy these neat boundaries of nationality. They birth these fusion as like a sort of intermediary space between nations. They birth a kind of combined or hybridized culture. The problems of this racism and sexism is that they are enforced through what she says the rules of academia or the rules of the standardizing of languages. And so those that govern Spanish and English speaking, the hybridized language are bound to break these rules. And so they are especially oppressed because they don't adhere to any of this standardization. And then one of the ways that they break them is in terms of Spanish is through the gendering of Spanish nouns. Technically referring to something in the feminine breaks the official rules and the standards of the language, which she mentioned there's a few different versions of Chicana slang that do this. And then she says that it's often policed and shamed despite being a cultural norm for the people who use it. It doesn't get in the way of their understanding of the language. She said there's racist policing of borderlands languages, from the Anglo side and sexist policing of it from the Mexican side, or at least that's her argument. And so then she says, for a people who cannot entirely identify with either standard, what recourse is left for them but to create their own language? So she is saying part of the reason that hybridized cultures and languages exist at all is they are a product of borders. Borders and the oppression of borders force this sort of hybridization. The world of the borderlands that she describes of straddling the line is a dangerous one, then, because oppression is a violent affair. As she says in the chapter, wild tongues can only be cut out. We see this violence in the poem too, that you saw for the provocation, where she describes the body as a battleground, and that living in this borderlands, La Frontera is like being caught in the crossfire. She mentions gunshots, bullet wounds, and in some cases that's a play with the literal because there is policing and gunfire, but also the feeling of it, the feeling of the violence. But counter to the shame that comes from not speaking properly, Anzaldúa marks hybridized language as a sign of resiliency and survival. And also, just to explain this title, linguistic terrorism, this is not in the section you read necessarily or in this book, or it might be in the section you read, but it's a theory that she elaborates in a different book where she says part of what these oppressive forces do is a kind of linguistic terrorism, a um, and that's the violence of both resistance to the oppression and also the oppression itself. So for Anzaldúa, there's a kind of power in being specific and refusing to be easily or readily translatable or understood, especially to the dominant cultures. You probably saw that in that poem. If you are not a Spanish speaker, or if you can't speak both languages, or if you're not familiar with some of the slang she uses that's particular to Chicana or Chicano speaking, then that the poem will, in some ways, there's going to be aspects of it that you can't quite understand. And for her, that is a powerful move. This refusing to be easily or readily translatable or understood. Her own writing in Borderlands, again, in the book and in the chapter, follows this politic. She often oscillates between poetry, prose, English, different varieties of Spanish, indigenous as languages, an indigenous Aztec language called Atzlan. She says, there is joy in recognition. The first time she reads the hybrid Tex-Mex poetry, she says, quote, I felt like we really existed as a people, as a people. And I think we want to think a little bit more about that in relation to nationalism and imagined communities, that recognizing through a shared language, she was able to conceive of a people or a kind of people that she belonged to, and that she did not see necessarily in the dominant culture of either nation. She says there's also power in hybridized identities and that they refuse really powerful and, in her experience, oppressive structures like the nation and the border, which means she's not a separatist or a counter-nationalist because she's not a believer in the purity of culture, ethnicity, race, or nation. Hers is an approach to identity that projects that all borders, whether geographic or cultural, will inevitably be crossed, and ethically they should be. She says, towards the end, deep in our hearts, we believe that being Mexican is a state of soul, not one of mind, not one of citizenship, neither eagle nor serpent, but both, and like the ocean, neither animal respects borders. So now we'll move to W.E.B. Du Bois, and it is in his telling pronounced Du Bois, and his assessment of how Black American identity creates an experience of fragmentation, not necessarily hybridization, or we might think of it as a fragmentation that gets kind of hybridized in a different way. I think it's fair to say that both think of this as, or these processes as functions of oppression or subordination by a dominant national culture or ideology. And this is not to say they consider the experience of this subordination to be wholly different or unrelatable, but they are describing them in slightly different terms. We might think more about what this difference in conceiving identity means for how either is relating to the nation as a political or cultural project. So W.E.B. Du Bois is William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. He lived from 1869 to 1963. He is often called or considered the father of American sociology, and he is a preeminent figure of Black studies in the United States and also, I would say, transnationally. You were reading from The Souls of Black Folk. You read, and the sections you read were the forethought and the first chapter called Of Our Spiritual Strivings. So, some key ideas from the text. He has this sort of question that pops up pretty early, which is when he's thinking, when he's asked what he thinks about race, he says that people are kind of asking him, how does it feel to be a problem? Being, quote, born a problem, something you pick up is something you pick up on from the reactions of the people around you. And not only from there, but from all aspects of culture and how one is represented and reacted to within it. So it's not just amongst, and it's interesting the way he frames this question being asked of him, which is it's not just amongst the stereotypically racist Southerners, but buried in the questions and approaches of those in the North, who imagine themselves to be better than those in the South at the time of his writing. It is their question, how does it feel to be a problem, where through their words they too imply that he is a problem to them as well, and in certainly in their conception of their own national identity or in relation to the nation. Some of the key ideas we get from him is these two, the veil and double consciousness. The veil being what well, actually, we can move to the veil. The veil being, then it dawned upon me, and this is from his quote, with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, or like mayhap in heart and life and longing, but shut out from the world by a vast veil. So this first comes to him when he's in his childhood. He offers a gift to a young white girl at school. He's at a school that's and this is true that some schools were integrated at certain periods of time. They get segregated later on. But he gives a gift to a girl at school and she refuses it. And for no other reason that he can figure out. And it occurs to him that there's some kind of barrier through which that keeps them separate, keeps them apart. And the barrier comes down in his consciousness. He sees it for the first time. And so he is shut out from the larger dominant culture. He says their world, shut out from their world by a vast veil. Double consciousness is probably the most infamous or famous theory that comes out of this. And this is the passage where it comes from. He says, quote, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil. And so there we see the veil again, and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. We might think of Anzaldúa, the body as a battleground, as she says in the poem, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And so this sort of famous representation of this is a novel by Richard Wright, Native Son. In this novel, you have the main character, Bigger, and Bigger is he gets a job chauffeuring for a white family, a wealthy white family, and the wealthy daughter gets drunk. He has to carry her inside. And an example of his double consciousness is he is extremely he needs to carry her inside, but he's really conscious of what it looks like for him to be doing that. So he can't just carry somebody inside. He's thinking about socially what it appears and how it will be read. And it will only be read as him having violated or attacked her. And indeed, that is the supposition, and it's the sort of inciting events of the book, is that he has to go on the run um, from the police. But that's sort of an infamous example of double consciousness at work. He knows that he'll be viewed criminally. So Du Bois also has something to say about what this means for art and culture over time. He says that double consciousness means there's double aims of the Black artist. He says, quote, that there's a kind of waste that happens that's a product of internalized racism. He says this waste of double aims, this seeking to satisfy two unreconciled ideals, has wrought sad havoc with the courage and faith and deeds of 10,000 people. And that's just how maybe people would refer to large numbers at a certain point in time. It has sent them often wooing false gods and invoking false means of salvation, and at times has even seemed about to make them ashamed of themselves. The image I have here is Butterfly McQueen playing an infamous Mammy role in Gone with the Wind, the film. And this is sort of an example of early Black actors and actresses Black actors had to take on really racist depictions to be involved in film and television at all. And so this is sort of what he's talking about with the double aims, that it is bad for art. It is bad for Black people making art because they are chronically making it for the dominant culture and therefore have to incorporate some of these racist ideas, whether consciously or subconsciously. And so for him, that is a wasteful effort. It's a wasteful process. He says, on the one hand, their knowledge of stereotypes about themselves, of the American view of them, forces them to treat other Black people and themselves poorly and to produce art that is for an audience and perspective they can never really occupy. So it just ends up in his idea being bad art because it is neither true of the Black experience, nor is it truly from the white perspective either. And yet, that's Butterfly McQueen as Prissy. And she spent her career typecast as a maid. And this is actually a quote from Butterfly McQueen. She said, quote, I didn't mind playing a maid the first time because I thought that was how you got into the business. But after I did the same thing over and over, I resented it. I didn't mind being funny, but I didn't like being stupid. And so again, this problem is of in the internalization of racism. What Du Bois says is a chronic condition of self-questioning, self-disparagement, and lowering of ideals. So our question, does Du Bois want to be included in the American project? and this is something we kind of asked ourselves about Frederick Douglass, does he consider himself to be American? We have this lengthy passage from Du Bois. He says, "We, the darker ones, come even now, not altogether empty-handed. There are today no truer exponents of the pure human spirit of the Declaration of Independence than the American Negroes. There is no true American music but the wild, sweet melodies of the Negro slave. The American fairy tales and folklore are Indian and African. And all in all, we black men seem the sole oasis of simple faith and reverence in a dusty desert of dollars and smartness. Will America be poorer if she replace her brutal, dyspeptic blundering with light-hearted but determined Negro humility, or her coarse and cruel wit with loving, jovial good humor, or her vulgar music with the soul of the sorrow songs?" We see here something similar to what Frederick Douglass wrote in What to the Slave is the Force of July, where he delineates between being Black and being American, like he makes that distinction. He does see himself as outside of the national identity, but Du Bois comes around in the end, at least in this writing. In his later writings, he certainly argues differently. But in the time that this comes out, he's still for it. Du Bois suggests that the only true American identity, in terms of its founding ideals, the ones outlined in the in the Declaration of Independence, um, is found in the Black experience. So he's not saying that Black people are only true Americans, but he's saying if it's about pursuit of liberty, etc., the only people really doing that are the formerly enslaved. And everybody else is depriving liberty or participating in that process. So these are your critical questions for today. And this is sort of directing you towards the cultural object analysis. Where have you seen representations of hybridization or creolization or fragmentation in mass culture, movies, TV songs, videos, books, etc.? And or to use the language from the text, any examples of living in the borderlands or double consciousness? Can we consider any of the identity formations described by Anzaldúa and Du Bois as national identities or part of the national identity? Should we? Why or why not? Remember to finish up your reflection sheet, take a look at the provocation. Next week, we're moving directly into a unit very much about the role of the law in constructing the national imagination. Not laws as literally enforcing ideas, but ideas that are expressed, established, and find their basis in the making of the law. We have a longer excerpt from Linda Gordon's Great Arizona Orphan Abduction, which is a really bizarre and interesting piece of history from the early 20th century, where a group of Irish Catholic orphans were adopted by Mexican families in Arizona through the Catholic Church. And then those orphans were abducted at gunpoint in the middle of the night by white Protestants living out there. And a very big lawsuit happens between the church and the abductors. It's an early example of where race, religion, and nation start to form harder lines in the United States. Sorry, excuse me. We are also looking at selections from the final decision in one of the most influential court cases in U.S. history, Downs v. Bidwell, which held up that the island of Puerto Rico was to be considered technically, in the ruling's language, in the United States, but not of it. Domestic in the foreign sense. And to this day, Puerto Rico remains in a kind of limbo in terms of whether it has national sovereignty or is part of the contiguous United States. So that's it for today. I will see you all next week.